Good, time to start. Good morning, this is Planet Retail RNG. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to our webinar on China. This is Planet Retail RNG. Welcome to our webinar on China, which is the world's largest food market and the global frontrunner in retail innovation and still a massive growth engine for the global consumer goods industry. We are running this webinar today to highlight some of our very recent research, which is available at full length in a new report called Future Retail Disruption China STEIP. Now, what does STEIP mean, you may wonder? STEIP is an element of our content framework that will help you answer the question where to play and where to play. That can mean which region, which country in a geographic sense, or which channel are you going to play in big box, in discounters, hypermarkets, online on 3P platforms, or even which retailer or which ecosystem even. So I'll explain that in a minute. Just again, welcome, thanks for dialing in. And I'd like to highlight that you will be able to submit comments and questions during this webinar, and there will be an opportunity at the end of this presentation to answer them. So feel free to submit comments and questions via the chat box function, and we will look at them later. So quick word on who we are. I'm sure you are very familiar with it. And let me just try and change the page, really. So here we go. Planet Retail RNG is a global intelligence and advisory business exclusively focused on retail. We operate offices in London, Boston, Frankfurt, and Mumbai, as you can see on this slide. And this webinar today is coming to you from the Frankfurt office in Germany. We track over 2,000 leading retailers around the world. We have built a proprietary macroeconomic model with 4.5 million globally comparable data points. And by applying our STEIP methodology, as we will do today, we identify winning strategies that give insight on where to play, how to win. That's what we're here for. So the STEIP model is designed to understand the future, and that is the future of the world, the future of the consumer, and the future of retail. We look at drivers of change that will impact your business. By that, I mean drivers that define the future in society, in technology, in the economy, the industry, and in politics, always a big topic in China. We look at how the world is changing, and with it, the way people live and the way people shop and the way retailers need to serve their customers and the way suppliers can work with retailers to embed themselves in the customer journey. So let's look at China. China is a global top priority market for many, perhaps the top priority market. And why is it so important? First, the size and dynamics of the Chinese market absolutely cannot be ignored. China has been the world's largest food market since 2009, for almost a decade now. Next year, in 2019, it will also overtake the US as the world's largest overall retail market. National retail is set to grow by over 9% annually over the next 5 years, going to $5.6 trillion by 2022. And in a few years' time, by 2025, the Chinese retail market will be 45% bigger than the US, and food retail will be 3 times bigger than the US. So it's a massive market, and the fact that swift urbanization continues and mobile penetration is high and online platforms are growing fast, all that means that China's population addressable for modern retail is growing very rapidly. So that makes it a very attractive environment, and we think businesses not playing in China yet should go there now. China's consumers show strong demand for Western products, which are perceived as high quality, and this is especially true in sensitive food categories like the very famous baby formula. China's young consumers are also very open to innovation in terms of products and technology. They are happy to share data with retailers, but they also get bored easily. And this means Western brands will be welcomed with enthusiasm, but then once they're in, they will need to keep innovating to keep shoppers engaged. And retailers and brands must be aware, to mention that as well, that China, despite its size and despite all its growth dynamics, remains an emerging market. So per capita food spending is half the level found in the US. And this, along with an aging population, means there still is and there will always be strong demand for affordable quality products in China. Now, let's look at what the future in China might look like from a number of perspectives. First, let's look at the societal landscape. The first thing to note is that China's population ages very quickly. and the need for more income redistribution, the need to roll out a pension system will put pressures on both pensioners and the active workforce, also known as taxpayers. So retailers, again, must be aware that efficient operations are always a must in the mass market. Then, what next? The future landscape of small households means that shopping behaviors will be built around frequent small trips to a grocery store as well as e-commerce. And both of this will be deeply entrenched in Chinese consumer behaviors. Retailers need to make sure they invest in proximity and convenience and efficiencies here. Then, in terms of innovation friendliness, Chinese consumers are extremely open to innovation by global sort of standards. They share data with businesses freely, but as I mentioned earlier, they are also easily bored and ready to move on fast. So retailers, brands, and technology vendors operating in the Chinese market, they all need to work together to keep customers interested, engaged, and loyal, which is a good challenge. And finally, looking at fast urbanization, that is giving retailers and brands ever more efficient access to consumers. Internal migration from China feeds more first-time shoppers into modern retail, which is where much of the growth comes from. However, the social inclusion of rural migrants remains a concern and will always take some time, as the policy to promote the economic development of new arrivals at cities remains fairly limited. Now look at what China looks like from space. So a lot of urbanization has been going on already, mainly in the east and in the north, and it remains a priority for the Chinese government to develop the hinterlands economically. So there's a big, long story of economic development waiting for people operating in China. Looking at the future technology landscape, China has the world's largest population of internet users. Around 55% of Chinese have access to the internet, and ubiquitous connectivity, meaning everyone's online all the time, really enabled by mobile, enabled by the Internet of Things, by sensors. All that will make every retail touch point a source of data and influence in the future. Being a mobile-first market, and 95% of internet access happens through mobile in China now, as well as sophisticated digital integration and the lack of legacy infrastructures, all of this fuels innovation, and this gives space to radically consumer-focused business models that are now emerging all over China, including O2O ecosystems, the unmanned convenience stores, and the like. The increasing number of ways that digital technologies can influence how shoppers engage and make purchases, all of that will be led by more pervasive computer interfaces such as augmented reality, virtual reality, and voice. Artificial intelligence will lead to much faster and data-driven customer engagement and decision-making, and will drive personalization and efficiency in the market. This will obviously challenge organization to realign processes and people. And finally, automation, robotics, unmanned vehicles, lots of stories coming there from China. All of those will drive considerable supply chain and labor efficiencies in the market. And this will begin to touch and increase speed over the last mile. So lots of interesting stories to look at here, some of which are mentioned in our report. Now, moving on to the economic landscape in China, one, of course, is, again, urbanization and the growth in the addressable population. The share of China's addressable population to modern retail will grow to 61% in 2022, up from 55% 10 years earlier. So that's 6 percentage points, moving from unaddressable to addressable. This is a lot in absolute numbers. This means 128 million consumers have been added to the addressable population within just 10 years. That's twice of the UK's population. Then, as urbanization continues, so continues the arrival of new urban consumers, mainly from the countryside. But as I mentioned, many of them will enter cities at the bottom end of the income scale, and it'll take some time for them to go out. Still, there's a market opportunity that we will look at later. Then, with a growing with the government making heavy investments in infrastructure, in digital infrastructure, e-commerce is playing a key role in growing the share of the addressable population, as we know from the Alibaba, JD.com examples. And a seamless multi-channel offer is now mandatory for retailers hoping to win in the market. Then China, yes, continues to be an emerging market with per capita consumer spending relatively low by Western standards. We looked at some figures earlier. However, incomes will continue to grow rapidly, looking at 9 to 10% every year, triggering more aspirational consumer needs. And this opens up the way for more differentiated product offers as well as higher value consumer products. And finally, with millions of consumers crowded on just a few hundred square kilometers in a city and with city income levels above the country average, China's megacities actually offer very efficient access to lucrative consumer strata and therefore a good starting point for expansion. Now, let's move on to the industry landscape. What do we see coming here? The Chinese food market is and will remain dominated by small box formats, and that small box complemented by a growing online channel. So while hypermarkets and superstores are an important route to consumers with a market share of 6%, the really big growth dynamics in China will be in convenience, in the neighborhood, and in online. With physical shelf space limited and in a small box dominated market landscape, partnering with online platforms is vital for FMCG brands seeking to expand consumer reach. Chinese consumers' tech savviness and openness to innovation that we discussed earlier, and their willingness to share data with businesses mean that the grocery sector of the future will be digitally integrated and shaped by seamless shopper experiences. Retailers, obviously, and suppliers can't ignore this development. And finally, the independent food segment in China's retail landscape will continue to account for the biggest share of China's food market for many years, currently standing at around 70% of the market. It's really big. It's still growing in dollar terms. It's losing market share as modern trade grows faster, but it's a growth market in dollar terms. And as a result, every FMCG business with mass market ambitions in China should build an independent trade strategy on top of what it does with modern bricks and mortar, with online, with 3P, and with direct vending. And this takes us to a quick overview of how politics will shape the future of the Chinese market. First, in late 2017, at the Big Party Conference, which takes place every 5 years, China's government made it clear that it will tighten the control of the economy and the internet. So for any business operating in China, legal compliance must be as high a priority as healthy relationships with governmental bodies. And it can go anecdotally as far as the Communist Party setting up trade union cells inside Western businesses operating in China. So government influence is definitely something to keep on the radar. Then the government has been restricting the access of foreign companies to China to protect the home market businesses. For example, Facebook and Twitter can't operate in China to the benefit of Tencent/WeChat. So FMCG brands seeking a presence in the digital space, they must build long-term partnerships with domestic digital platforms and retailers. Then, as mentioned earlier, it's a big priority for the Chinese government to economically develop the hinterlands, the provincial areas, and this will be a long-term source of economic growth for China. And finally, some legal requirements worth mentioning, such as the sharing of customer data with government authorities. And this is to support a mandatory citizen scoring system, which will go live by 2020. Alibaba and JD.com already share all their data with the government, and businesses operating in China must be aware this is happening, and this involves a certain reputational risk in the Western public domain in the US and Europe that needs to be carefully managed. Now, excuse me. Now, we took some of the points that we mentioned in the report, some of the drivers of change, and grouped them into risks and opportunities. China, like every market, has its challenges, so let's take a quick look at those. There are some related to politics. So there's government tightening control of the economy, including the freedom of the internet, which sort of slows down the national startup culture and innovation rate, productivity growth, and therefore income growth. is held back by government support of inefficient state-owned enterprises. Excuse me for a second. So a quick cough, really. Then retailers will be under pressure to share customer data with the government to support a national citizen scoring system, also known as surveillance state. And then there's new online legislation in the making with impact on retailing. There are some gray areas currently, but we are confident these will be sorted out over the coming year. Then on the household side, households are small, shrinking, and this will fuel proximity and convenience-based and online shopping, and that puts big box under pressure. So big box as a sort of window of visibility to consumers is not going to be as big in China. It's never going to be as big as in China as it is now in Europe or in the US. And with this domination of small box and online, shelf space will be very limited, will be a scarce commodity, and this creates competition and challenges around brand visibility. And finally, this previously mentioned consumer demand for innovation will keep pressure continuously high on businesses to innovate and keep customers engaged. Now, these are the risks and challenges, and again, there is no market without challenges. And let's take a look at the opportunities now that we identified. So China is the world's largest food market, will grow around 9% over the next 5 years per year. Urbanization is going on really fast, which pushes up the addressable population at extreme speed. Mega cities and regional hyper-urban hubs, which the government is now building and connecting, serve as consumer markets with great resilience to economic shocks, because all of these rest on several growth pillars at the same time. When the economy is a bit weaker, there's still population growth, so big resilience in urban space. Then government promoting income growth in the provincial areas to support socially inclusive development could do a better job in the cities, but clearly something very promising is happening here. And the population is aging fast, which puts pressure on the middle class, and that means there will be lots of opportunities for efficient players that can offer quality at affordable prices. Moving on to the middle block, a bit sort of tech and online heavy. China features the world's largest population of internet users, and the digitally addressable part of the addressable population is growing particularly fast. The government is plowing money in infrastructure expansion, clearly including the digital infrastructure. China is leading in tech innovation with few legacy systems in the way. So whereas in Europe, O2O systems need to be built around an existing hypermarket landscape, Chinese businesses can really start from a white sheet of paper and build a radically customer-focused business model. Now, consumers in China are among the world's most open to new experiences, technologies, and data sharing, which is why China is always worth watching, even for businesses not operating there, because much of what we see in China now might be part of the future of retail in Europe and the US. Online to offline grocery formats are now pushed by the leading online players as the market turns into an omni-channel driven environment, and unmanned convenience stores are emerging fast with potential for structurally weak regions. So as several players now roll out unmanned kiosks and neighborhood stores, that is an opportunity for brands to really expand again China's addressable population and take a leading position in structurally weak areas of the country, which are full of people who spend money on food too. And then finally, internal migration in China is creating a cultural diversity that retailers need to cater for. That is a challenge, but it's a massive opportunity as well. And independent trade growing in absolute term absolutely can't be ignored, difficult to penetrate, but big segment to win in the mass market. And again, some technological innovation around the last mile fulfillment or unmanned convenience stores might be an answer to those challenges. Now, and this takes us to the last part. So we picked 5 recommendations for suppliers playing in China. And there's many more in our report, but just highlighting some of the big stories here. So one is around brand visibility. So the modernization of China is not driven by hypermarkets. Modernization in other emerging regions, such as Central and Eastern Europe, 20 years ago was driven by Western hypermarket operators planting stores all over the place. This is not happening in China. No, modernization in China is driven by small box and by neighborhood convenience formats and by digital. So for suppliers, this means their strategic marketing resources must be aligned to a different reality, to a reality that's very different from Europe, which is a reality of extremely limited physical shelf space, very tough competition for listings, and rapid growth online. Then digital routes to market. So in the digital place, there are some sort of ecosystems that stand out as routes to consumers. And mainly that's 3P platforms and former pure play giants that over time are building O2O ecosystems, Alibaba, JD.com, who totally dominate Chinese online, along with Tencent. You know, they are increasingly building their ecosystems with physical presences and connecting the different parts of the ecosystem. So capabilities around e-commerce and digital ecosystem management will be absolutely key to win in China's FMCG space. The urban space opportunities. So we know urbanization is moving on really fast in China, and that drives fast growth of the country's addressable population, as we discussed. And this means China's cities are a natural starting point for market entrance. And cities often are bigger than countries in China. And partnering with retailers, platforms, and wholesalers, you know, is a good sort of way to start a market presence, but also, you know, if you're a smaller FMCG business, moving on across China on a city-by-city basis is a very proven and promising strategy. No need to sort of build capacities to supply to all of China. You can start smaller than that. China offers plenty of opportunities for that, with over 80 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. In terms of innovation, Chinese consumers, more than in any other major markets, they want innovation, they get bored easily, so suppliers should be proactive about the opportunity to support retailers in keeping clients engaged with product innovation. And finally, product safety. Food safety is high on the agenda, still has been for many years, after a series of highly publicized scandals, especially around baby food. And international FMCG brands can win here by highlighting the Western origins, their safety, their transparency credentials, and this label of made in Europe, made in Germany, made in the Netherlands is really important to many Chinese mums, which is where the online platforms are a great route to the consumer. Oh, and finally, the independent rate, obviously, just to highlight, this is growing very fast in dollar terms. It's not going to go away for decades. So any FMCG player with true mass market ambitions cannot just be on the online platforms and in the hypermarkets and in the physical convenience stores, but there must be routes to independent traders as well. And finally, the data protection recommendation. Suppliers must be aware of the political risk that's associated with trading on a Chinese e-commerce and 3P platform. Again, all the big players are sharing all the data with the government, and the government is in the process of building a citizen scoring system. So suppliers must be aware of the impact this can have on their brand reputation in the US and Europe. We know what it was like for Apple, Google when they started sharing data in China with the government, and retailers and FMCG doing business in China must be prepared of similar public debates, and the Western home base need to be prepared for that. I think that's a clear political risk. And this essentially takes me to the end of the presentation. Now let's see if there's any questions coming in from the audience. So one is, you mentioned the fact that China's population is aging fast. Can you share some more detail about what this implies? Yes, I can. So China went through its period of economic rise at a time when almost every member of the society was in the active workforce. There was always children, but there was a very small share of pensioners, and this is now changing. So the share of pensioners in China's population is going to roughly double within a generation. I think it's around 16, 17% today, and in in 30 years' time, the share of pensioners will be over 30% in China. This really means the government will have to think about an income redistribution system, about a proper pension system. And of course, this creates pressure on the workforce. So the number of active workforce per pensioner has been dropping since 2011. So I think at the beginning of the decade, there were around 3.5 working people per pensioner, and now we're at around 2.5 working people per pensioner. So taxpayers are going to notice the difference very strongly. So again, for retailers and suppliers, obviously this means the need for efficiency, the need for affordable quality will absolutely not go away, because pensioners and the workforce, yes, incomes will rise, but at the same time, this demographic pressure will continue to be on everyone for many, many years, for decades, in fact. Then another interesting question: will the end of China's one-child policy reverse the trend? Well, I don't think so. Very debatable, but I think when the one-child policy was introduced 40 years ago, it was very controversial, seen as brutal by some. And 40 years on, if you talk to people in China, I think most people have started to perceive a 3-person family as a very normal thing. And they no longer see themselves as deficient with just one child, and also with urbanization going on so fast. Much of the Chinese property market is now designed around the concept of a 3-person family. So I do not currently observe much pressure for families to get bigger. So I think really retailers and FMCG must be prepared for a small household scenario in the long term, and all the shopping behaviors that are associated with it. Then how fast is urbanization progressing in China? Will China be a fully urbanized market? Well, probably not. Let me just get out the statistics here from the report. So urbanization has gone up very, very fast in China. In 1950, around 10% of the population lived in urban space. And in 1990, when communism broke down in the West and market economic reforms accelerated, around 30% were in urban space. And now this is going to reverse within a generation. So by 2050, only 30% of China's population will be in rural space. So within slightly more than half a decade, the urbanization rate in China is going up from 10% to over 70%. Yeah, good question. That takes China close to a fully urbanized society. Yet, again, China has over 80 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants, and I think China has over 10 cities with more than 20 million, if I'm not wrong. And this means within this huge urban landscape, there's always cities and regions that can be seen as independent sub-economies. And China, with its different climatic zones and its internal immigration streams, also is probably more like a continent than like a country. And so it would not necessarily make sense to start selling into China as one market from the start. It's about picking the starting points, and there are plenty of them. Right, what other questions have we got coming in? China isn't known as a market with substantial immigration. How strong is the need to differentiate products? Yeah, good point. So China really doesn't get a lot of external immigration from other countries. It probably has a small number of Chinese who used to live in Europe or the US coming back to China, which sort of shapes the upper mid-market in cities. But it's limited numbers. I think it's 1 million people per year. The really big thing about cultural diversity in China is people from very different regions that have moved into the cities to find jobs, looking for a better life over the decades. And this creates a melting pot of many, many different cultures within each individual city in China. Then what have we got? Can you give some examples of innovative retail models in China? Yes, I think so. So we discussed the checkout less stores, the unmanned kiosks, as, for example, Auchan, with its local partner, recently launched Auchan Minute, which is unmanned, unstaffed little neighborhood stores that obviously has big potential in the lower income neighborhoods of cities and in the rural areas of China. Then there's O2O systems like Alibaba's Hema store model, which is an upmarket experiential supermarket where you can order online and where products are sort of delivered within, I think, a couple of hours within a radius of around 3 kilometers. So that certainly has a future in China's highly densely populated cities. Then China is really leading in terms of mobile payment. So mobile payment is a segment that's many times bigger than in the US and China, and young people in the cities often don't even use cash anymore. Then there's interesting experiments going on around autonomous delivery. So JD.com in January had its first autonomous delivery cart sort of driving through an open city in China. So that's some examples of the modernization we see here. So many examples included in the report, but also available from our team and from our Store of the Future reports, etc. There's a lot of material available at Planet Retail RNG. Then what else have we got? How big is the opportunity in independent trade that you mentioned? Again, I think it's really big. So let me just pull up the statistics from the report here. Modern trade in China, probably accounting for 70% of food sales, is losing market share. Yes, that's true. But we think it's still going to grow 7.8%, nearly 8% per year over the next 5 years. And modern trade is growing even faster, which is the sort of bricks and mortar stores, and digital growing by 10% per year, but 8% per year for independent trade, that's still substantial and tells us independent trade will be around for many, many years. And the reason independent trade is growing is that, with the way Chinese food retail is structured, any additional income by families will very often be spent at their local independent stores and markets. So income growth is what fuels the growth of the independent sector. So this is clearly a part of the market that is going to stay relevant for as long as we live. And time for one more question before we sort of close out. Any further questions that will be coming in, we'll reach out to you in the coming hours. The last question for the session, you highlighted the strategy to focus on individual cities initially when entering China. Can you give some details on that? Yes, so basically this is about the size of the cities and the size of the market and the cultural diversity of the market. It's almost impossible to serve the great variety of people that live in China with one and the same product portfolio all over the place. China in the sense really is more like a continent than a country. And there are many cities in China that are bigger than countries as retail markets. So consumer spending in Shanghai is as big as consumer spending in Malaysia, for example, Shanghai, Chongqing, Guangzhou, Beijing. There are many cities that are bigger than most European countries in their own right. And so many medium-sized FMCGs do take this route, gaining experience, building relationships in one city, and then taking it from there on a city-by-city basis. I think that's the questions we can answer this morning. And this takes us to the end of the city. Now, what you can do, obviously, is you can reach out to us with any questions. And for questions we haven't been able to answer now, we'll reach out to you within the next few hours. You can also download the report, China STEIP, from our portal. And we can help you around all related content that we had from our portfolio of winning strategies. So feel free to read the reports or reach out to us. We're very happy to help you find the right piece of insight for you. And with this, I close the session and thank you very much for dialing in today. Have a good day. All the best.